You're listening to Vermont Credit Unions on Air, a service of the Association of Vermont Credit Unions. I'm Joe Bergeron, president of the association. We're recording this podcast at right about the midpoint of the Vermont Legislature's 2020 session. And so thought it a good idea to take the temperature of this session and share some thoughts about what's happened so far and what we might be looking forward to. To do that, we've enlisted the aid of the two lead members of our association's State House advocacy team, Adam Necrason and Jessica Oski. That's what a blooper right away. Thanks very much, Adam and Jessica, for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
And
Thanks,
you're on break this week, so this is like a little vacation for you during the State House session, right?
Yes, town meeting week break is a welcome.
Yeah, welcome break, not exactly vacation.
Correct.
Right. So anyway, so we're at about the midpoint. Crossover is when legislators return next week, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like I already said, what's happened in the first half and what do we have to look forward to? So Adam, how about we start with you?
Sure. Some highlights from the first half. It's important to start with the governor, Phil Scott, who's very popular and experienced at this point in his leadership at the state capitol. His big events are a budget address and a State of the State address, and they come out late in January, and they really are the governor of our state's big moment in the legislative session to kick off an agenda. Governor Scott's high notes were that we have a real demographic challenge in Vermont. We're an aging state, and we don't have enough young people in our schools and in our workforce. He's got a lot of concern about the rural economy. The urban counties are kind of the hot part of our economy, and he's got a lot of concerns about the rural counties' economies and workforce. Lack of workers to fill jobs in Vermont is a real challenge. So the governor's package of fiscal leadership and policy agendas really galvanize around those concerns. And he kicked those off in January, and then the other kind of high note are that the legislative committees immediately go into a bunch of work, and we're nearing crossover and have spent 7 or 8 weeks. Jessica keeps tabs on things real close, and committees have been churning away and trying to produce their big legislation. There's some big topics that have been on the House floor and in the legislature, and we can talk about them some more. But cool. Jessica, what's your sense of the kind of early opening big thoughts?
Just for those that don't know the phrase crossover, it's the date at which bills that are moving have to be out of the body in which they were introduced if they're going to make it over to the other half and have a chance at survival before the end of the session. And that's Friday the 13th. So committees have been busy trying to get their work done so that their bills that are their priorities have a chance to move. There's nothing. I mean, everything.
You said it all. The two of you.
Yeah, you took the win. So keep
Friday
going
the
with
13th for
Yeah.
crossover day. Wow.
Yeah.
I have a board meeting that day too, so it's going to be a bad day all the way around. Probably.
It's a busy day. We don't go home till late that night.
You touched on the governor's priorities and whatnot, and one of those was about workforce. And I know this is not specific to credit unions, obviously, but every time I'm together with a group of business leaders from throughout the state, or talking to credit unions, that issue comes up frequently, that they don't have a whole lot of some challenge, but not as much challenge at the low end of the wage range for jobs or the very high end, but it's that middle section where they're looking for some degree of expertise and whatnot. That's the biggest crunch kind of area.
Right, and lawmakers, what the governor and lawmakers are doing about that is trying to address a number of issues around living and working in Vermont, affordability of housing being top among them. And so, there's a bunch of activity in the State House working on trying to make more affordable middle-income workforce housing.
Yeah. Cool. So you talked about the governor's priorities. So what have been the big issues in the State House between the two of you so far that legislators have been trying to move, or maybe have gotten traction or not, but whatever their hot issues have been?
Right. I'll rattle a list and then we can talk about them a little bit. Minimum wage, increasing the minimum wage, which did successfully move forward despite a gubernatorial veto. That was a real big event at the State House. It's a rare moment in the state capitol when the legislature overrides a gubernatorial veto, and that has only happened on the minimum wage legislation so far. It failed to happen on paid family leave.
And relative to other minimum wage increases in other states or other locations, this one is pretty modest. It just goes up to $12.55 by 2022.
Wow.
Yep.
And it stops there. It doesn't continue beyond there.
No, I think there's an inflationary factor built in, but
Yeah, there had been a lot of talk about building in a legislative path to $15 an hour, and ultimately the governor's objections to that level of change led lawmakers to scale back their ambition and move this incremental change to the minimum wage. That turned into a battle where he had vetoed even that change, and in a unique moment, they had literally 100 votes in the House of the 100 needed. So there was no room to spare.
So
there.
when there's maybe this is not a very informed question, but I'm going to ask anyway. So when there's a veto override by the Democratic-controlled Senate and House over the governor's veto of that minimum wage bill or any bill, does that have overriding effects on the legislation that comes after that, things that the governor's trying to get through maybe?
It does color the tension in the building, and the dynamic before this minimum wage vote was that the governor could not be overridden, and so it has created more expectations of the legislative Democrats that they can drive their agenda despite the governor, and it has increased the governor's focus on can I compromise on certain measures,
Sure.
or where are the lines in the sand that I will have to be very sharp about.
Sure.
And since we're in an election year, everyone's thinking about the public relations of
Right.
their work, and
Right.
and so it's a pretty tense time in that regard.
because these two override votes were very close and one passed and one failed, I think that still leaves the governor in a bit of a power position. It would be different if it was a slap shot and
Right.
both of them were overridden by the House, but they're very close and every issue is slightly different, and those folks in the middle could go either way. So
That's
there's a
right.
lot
The
of
barn
pressure
doors
there.
have not been thrown open
Yeah.
at the State House for the Democrats' agenda at all. And
Interesting.
in fact, the governor's hesitancy continues to be the main factor on any major piece of legislation. For example, climate change legislation is really hot, and there are several bills that, and we will see a potential veto showdown there as well. And it's kind of the next big one in the making. Another hot topic that is headed to final reconciliation between the House and the legislature,
The House and the Senate.
and the Senate and the governor. Basically, they're going to sort out finally, after years of work on the cannabis retail regulation agenda. It does seem to be moving forward. We'll see over the next month some final details get sorted out. Whether the bill earns the governor's support comes down to a few key issues, but it is next up and does have implications for the credit union community because there are
The finance,
the finance
aspect of
all
business,
that. Right.
So even when that legislation, that's S54, I think it is,
Correct.
right? So even when or if or and when that legislation passes, creating the regulatory structure, and I think it creates like a cannabis commission or something along
Control
that
board.
Control board, right. But do I recall correctly, there's still going to be a couple of years lead time probably, or some lead time anyway,
Quite a bit.
to actually create all this regulation
That's right.
structure.
The
and
legislation
process.
will pass, and that will begin a regulatory process that involves standing up a regulatory structure and then issuing licenses. And
The licenses aren't expected to issue under the proposal until January 2022.
So even if legislation passes now, creating the statutory structure for retail recreational businesses, unlike in Massachusetts and Maine, I guess it is now, we're not going to see those kinds of businesses in Vermont, or not legally anyway, for a few
Couple
more
years,
years anyway.
yeah.
Wow.
And that bill, the Senate passed a version of the bill and the House just passed a version of the bill. So now there's going to be a conference committee of the two bodies to work out the details, and that could take a few weeks before they
Sure.
come up with whatever compromises they're going to come up with.
Not a credit union issue, and probably not something that you've been following. But the governor's, well, am I correct in remembering the governor had some desire to have a better system of roadside testing, and did
That's right. That's right. He wanted local control,
right?
some impairment testing on the roadside,
Yep.
and investment in prevention of inappropriate use and youth access.
Sure.
And the legislation is kind of trying to address each of those, and follow the news over the next few weeks to see the governor's judgment on whether they've met his mark or not.
Interesting. So, what else?
Moving to credit union issues.
Okay.
There's two big topics that are in the air, and auto lending being the main one among them. Concerns about consumer protection in the purchase of automobiles, particularly used automobiles, is something that legislative committees have been working on for years, and it's possible this year there'll be some legislation. The other, just to throw it out there, unclaimed property, which is something where we'll see potential changes in regulations or practices that will impact credit unions. But on both of these, I really look to you, Jessica, to help us understand a little bit more about the details.
On the auto financing, a lot's been made about some of the problems with auto financing and potential fraud. What actually passed the Senate is not major. It's not a major change. It basically requires a dealer to provide a copy of the consumer's credit application, that the application that's used to secure financing, to the consumer before they leave the dealer. And that sounds kind of like a no-brainer. But what had been happening is these applications were sent off to the financial institution or the financing company, and the financing was issued, but it was oftentimes based on information that was not accurate, and the consumer was not able to complete the terms of the agreement. So by providing a copy of the agreement, hopefully the consumer can see what information was supplied to the dealer, and everyone can agree that the application was accurate.
And there was also originally a provision in there requiring the lender making the loan, a credit union in our case, to also provide a copy of that very same application, but that seemed kind of redundant and got dropped, right?
Exactly.
Jessica, is it fair to say the concerns are not with credit union practices, but
Not at
more
all.
with the potential that a person of less means is in a car buying moment and having a car salesperson kind of inflate their numbers and essentially get them into a loan they can't afford?
Exactly. And there was, during this debate, there were no references to credit unions doing acting in bad faith. It was really about the dealers primarily. And what we heard from credit unions is that when they have interactions with dealers that are questionable, many credit unions stop dealing with those dealers.
Sure. But just so we don't cast aspersions, although we didn't initiate this legislation, this wasn't like, or was there an assumption that this kind of activity of falsifying loan documentation was rampant across dealers in the state of Vermont? I assume it was, some specific instances that came up
Not rampant at all, but enough of a problem that
to catch attention, right?
that they felt action was needed.
Sure.
Yeah, lawmakers in Montpelier bring a pretty sharp pencil to consumer protection. It's really a topic,
right.
not just auto lending at all, but across all sorts of issues. The Vermont legislature has got a real keen eye on consumer protection.
Well, I think every legislator is going to be responsive when one of their constituents calls up and says, hey, such and such happened to me, whatever the case might be, and I didn't feel that was right or whatever. And whether it's justified or not, legislators are going to be responsive to that because those are their constituents.
Yeah, it's really a testament to the Vermont style of legislature and governing that we have such an accessible, community-based group of people in the state capitol who are not professional politicians. They're not well paid. They're not heavily staffed. It's really a people-based conversation down there. And Jessica, we often see individual stories really galvanize a moment, and then lawmakers look under the hood and say, oh my goodness, there's a little bit of something going on here.
More to the story, right?
Let's try and nip this in the bud. Or
So what else, Jessica, is happening in the financial services area that should be of interest to credit unions?
Well, luckily, not a lot. Because while we do have a strong consumer protection angle in our legislature, it's often better that they, from a financial institutions perspective, that they stay out of our business for the most part. As Adam mentioned, the unclaimed property bill, this is a huge rewrite of how unclaimed property is managed in the state, and it will impact the work that credit unions do. You should be on the lookout for information coming from the Treasurer's Office or DFR over the summer, or possibly from Joe,
Sure.
Explaining those changes. Those are really the main things.
The high points.
Excuse me?
The high points.
Yeah, every year there's a bill that makes various changes to banking and insurance laws. There really wasn't anything in this year's miscellaneous bill that impacted credit unions.
Can we talk about the tax study for a second?
Sure.
And the bank angle on that? Because banks in the state of Vermont are subject to a franchise tax, right?
which is in lieu of the corporate income
Yes,
tax, which,
right,
as a
right.
credit union advocate, I'm often explaining to lawmakers, banks have outside owners. They pay profits to outside owners. Therefore, a corporate income tax at that layer, that level, makes sense. Whereas credit unions, nonprofit member-owned, we don't have outside owners. We pay profits to, and therefore, a corporate income tax does not apply to us. And we pay plenty of taxes: property taxes, employment taxes. So the credit
Rooms
union
and meals
movement, rooms and
taxes.
meals taxes. The credit union movement is a tax-paying, organization. But we don't have corporate income tax. I'm aggressive on this, Joe.
Because obviously you are, and rightfully so. But because of where the profits go.
That's right.
I know I was and I always point it out, but I was in a meeting with a group of people, I forget if it was yesterday or the day before, where somebody from another type of a cooperative was pointing out that not-for-profit cooperatives like credit unions do have to make a profit for safety and soundness purposes. It's just a matter of, where do those profits go?
Well, they're earnings, right? We talk
right.
about them as our earnings,
Right.
and we reinvest them in the members and for our safety and soundness. And, what our earnings going into our member owners for the credit union movement are profits being siphoned off
Sure.
and shipped out of state to Wall Street owners in the case of many banks. I know, Jessica, that the legislature was looking at changing the corporate bank tax, and so we've been keeping an eye on that. And
They were talking about repealing the bank franchise tax and replacing it with a corporate income tax, and many states tax banks that way.
Sure.
But the report, the legislature asked the tax department to look at this over the summer, along with a number of other issues related to the corporate tax, with the goal being, is there a way to structure our corporate taxes so that out-of-state corporations, including banks, but all corporations, pay more of a share of the tax than our in-state companies. The hands of the legislature are tied in some ways. They can't pass laws that intentionally favor out-of-state entities over in-state entities. There's some Commerce Clause issues there. But
the other way around, you mean we can't favor in-state
Right,
over
sorry, yeah,
out-of-state.
right.
Right. Because lots of states would start
Burden
kind of
out-of-state,
building walls
right.
and say, hey, out-of-state businesses, we're harming you because we want to have our own microeconomy.
Right, I meant burden out-of-state over
Right.
in-state. But there are some ways that they can structure their taxes so that has that effect. And so that's some of the things that the House Ways and Means Committee has been looking at. But the report that came back from the tax department, specifically on the bank franchise tax, said they really didn't have enough information. They need to do more study. The initial information that they had looked as if they moved to a corporate income tax to replace the bank franchise tax, the state could actually lose some money. And that could be because of the shelters and the tax
avoidance measures.
tax avoidance
right.
measures that banks would be
Sure.
able to employ.
Like any other business.
Right. So there's a little bit more study that needs to be done on that before the legislature can make a decision. I don't think there'll be any decision this year.
Just for those that aren't familiar, the current tax form of corporate tax that's imposed on banks in the state of Vermont, that franchise tax that we've referenced, is based on deposits that the institution holds in the state of Vermont, right?
Yeah, so decades ago, lawmakers
Right.
said, hey, we're going to have this bank franchise tax as a collection mechanism
Right.
for the corporate income tax. It was, it's a relatively straightforward way to have a reliable stream of income from that corporate tax component of state taxation.
And there
I
are
believe
some,
it's a little more stable too than the corporate income tax.
sure,
Is that right?
I wouldn't think. Well, I don't know about whether the amount of tax collected would fluctuate tremendously from period to period, but I would think that from a state of Vermont standpoint, collecting tax based on deposits would be probably an easier thing to gauge because it's on all the deposits. They either have the deposits or they don't, and there's no tax avoidance measures and so on and so forth, or tax shelter exercises and whatnot. So, so we'll keep an eye on that one and see whether it goes any further. So one big question that I've got, and it's not specific to credit unions, but it can affect what we have to do going forward as far as advocacy is concerned. This is an election year, right? And it's a big one in Vermont in that, one, there's a lot of offices to fill. And for us, it starts right at the top with, it's not every day or every cycle that we have someone from Vermont running for president of the United States. And then it goes down the list from there, right?
But it's not the first time.
No, it's not the first time. So I'm wondering if you feel comfortable talking about, what is what effect does that have either on the rest of this legislative session, or what happens after this legislative session when they adjourn in May sometime? It seems like, depending on who gets elected to what, there's a potential series of dominoes here that fall.
Yes, the fall elections are a big change election for Vermont State Capitol, potentially. The top of the ticket, the presidential, the race for governor, and the race for lieutenant governor are all going to be hotly contested, and we may see changes in the governor's office as a result, and we know we will have a new lieutenant governor because current Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman is running for governor.
Sure.
He's Phil Scott's main challenger.
Right.
There's a primary in August that candidates for governor and lieutenant governor have to get through. It's highly likely that David Zuckerman will be the candidate against Phil Scott, and they will have a hotly contested election. Lieutenant governor's got a lot of intrigue and plays into the state house because we already know that two current senators, the President Pro Tem Tim Ash and Senator Debbie Ingram, both from Chittenden County, are running for lieutenant governor. So as you said, there's some domino effect here.
Were either of those, sorry to interrupt, were either of those a surprise? Or
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, I would. It's not unsurprising when we talk about it and we think about these leaders. The race for lieutenant governor,
right?
Tim Ash and Debbie Ingram, and there are other candidates. The Democratic primary is where the action will be, and there's another candidate, Molly Gray, who works at the Attorney General's office, and so you already see that that's going to be, a crowded primary stage and ballot.
Sure.
But the atmosphere certainly in the state capitol has the air of an election year in it, where lawmakers are very focused on a couple things, adjourning so they can go out and run for office, getting the work done neatly and in a way that they feel good about, and some issues have, particular significance to leaders like the Pro Tem Tim Ash has been a champion of the minimum wage. It's really probably a number one issue for him. I mean, his politics are very similar to Bernie Sanders. They're very working class focused, and the minimum wage was core agenda for him, and that getting through, was a big victory.
So if you're running for a key office, it would be good to have in your bio or whatever, that you were effective.
An
on
accomplishment,
that
a
kind of
real
issue.
accomplishment that delivered to the kitchen table.
Right, right.
I think the conventional wisdom is that Phil Scott he's well liked, and under normal circumstances would probably, we don't even know if he's running yet. Actually, he has not announced. But if he does run, conventional wisdom would be that he might have an easy win in November. But the wild card here is that it is a presidential election year, and voter turnout could be different than in years past. This is an extremely energized year.
Meaning voter turnout could be higher.
Exactly.
Except not, according to all the NPR reports about Bernie Sanders, not in the young people category,
Right.
but across the board for total number of voters.
So it does present some unknowns for the November elections in Vermont. How will the national scene trickle down to
definitely
Vermont?
create we know there'll be a wave of voters who are motivated to vote for Donald Trump's challenger,
Sure.
the Vermont politics. But there was actually something interesting. We just had town meeting week, and I was reading some of the kind of tidbits that came out, and the election turnout was curious. I don't know if you noticed this, Joe and Jessica, the total number of primary voters, because we had our presidential primary at town meeting, even though we
Right.
have our state election primary in
Right,
August.
right.
The total number of primary voters was the same large number, but there were tens of thousands more that took a Democratic ballot. Seems natural that there was a contested Democratic presidential ballot there, and less so on the Republican side. But it does show you that there's this big block of independent-minded Vermont voters who sometimes pull a Republican ballot and sometimes Democratic one. And so that's what makes Phil Scott have a lot of viability, candidly, because a VPR poll came out recently, and he had very high favorability ratings. He was actually higher favorability with Democrats than with Republicans. In both cases, it was in the 50s.
So, we always say through the years, and I just don't know how true it is factually, but it feels like you hear a lot of people saying, when it comes to Vermont gubernatorial race, statewide offices and whatnot, that Vermonters typically don't vote party line. They vote for who they like. And they don't stick Democrat or Republican or whatnot, and that kind of that goes back to, well, not in recent history, like Jim Douglas, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of people that voted for Jim Douglas, who were not of his party, and so it feels like what you're saying is the same is true for Phil Scott.
Yes, our governor is chosen at the end of the day by independent swing voters in Vermont. That's very much been the history of Howard Dean, Jim Douglas, Peter Shumlin, and now Phil Scott.
So even
People vote for Bernie Sanders and Phil Scott, and people,
Right.
Republicans cross party lines
All the
and
time,
Democrats
sure.
cross party lines all the time.
Right. So kind of going against the grain of what the perception is when you read the press.
That's right. Yeah, the Vermont electorate has a lot of zigzag as it goes down the ballot.
Sure. And so it sounds like the fact that it's a heated election year, and that there's a lot of offices, I'll say up for grabs, but a lot of activity, a lot of press coverage and whatnot, has not had I don't know if you'd say negative effect on the legislative process in the State House in terms of legislators trying to rush things through or being more contentious about issues just to get something under their belt and whatnot.
We might see a little bit of that towards the end. Legislators, especially those that are running for another office, or all of them will be running for re-election, do want the session to end so that they can get out on the campaign trail and don't want things to drag on this year. And hopefully that'll be the case and that they'll go home early.
It is an orderly session so far, and we have not seen partisanship in an unusual way that kind of clouds the integrity of the work that's being done. There's a lot still on their plate in the next several weeks, and we'll see, in particular, climate change
Act 250.
and Act 250, kind of land use development reform,
Right.
kind of spring up as kind of hot topics where there is tension between the legislature and the governor.
So I was going to ask you about what we should expect in the second half of the session, but it sounds like you just touched on it for the most part. And as far as financial services and credit unions in particular, there's a few items that we're watching, but we don't expect any big surprises.
Hopefully not.
There'll definitely be a new law on auto lending that'll will work
Right.
well for us. There will, as a credit union person, there'll definitely be a new law on unclaimed property that people will have to this summer kind of understand regulatory compliance and
Sure.
learn about. The cannabis law will be a year or more in the making before
Right.
credit union officials have
Right.
to really make choices on how to engage or not.
In effect, but not really any impact for a couple of years yet. Right.
If there's a big change in the White House, that could impact the way that our law rolls out as well, and it could impact how credit unions and other financial institutions do business in this area.
Sure. So it's a little early to be asking you this, but I'll ask anyway. So depending on who gets elected to what, as far as statewide office and beyond there, you see much change in House and Senate leadership positions next year, potentially.
Yes, we know we will have a new leader of the Senate
Right.
in the vacancy that Tim Ash is creating. So the president pro tem, which is a very significant
Sure.
position. We haven't heard much about change in the House leadership.
No, but a lot of members have announced that they're not running. A number of key members have announced that they're not running again. So-
Typically, there are 30 plus new members of the legislature
over.
out of the 180. Heavily, the change is often most prominent in the House. It's a practically volunteer job. Lawmakers are not well paid.
Right.
It's a real challenge on your career or your personal life, and some are able to do it for long term and become veteran lawmakers, and some, particularly, people mid career, can come for a little while and do it, and then their career pulls them on, or family life, and so we're seeing a bunch of that, and there'll be lots of new lawmakers from that natural changeover.
So we've pretty much used up our allotted time, but I don't want to cut the discussion off. If there's anything else either one of you can think of that we haven't touched on that our listeners would probably or should hear about. But
Well, I'd wrap by just saying that as a credit union movement, it's really heartening to see how much the Association of Vermont Credit Unions and our members engage with lawmakers, because engaging the Vermont legislature is a very citizen-friendly space and small business accessible agenda there. And so, my closing thought, Joe, is that I feel like the credit union movement is really strong, together and engaged. We do a lot to bring credit union leaders to the State House, and credit to you as a leader of the credit union movement for engaging with a cooperative mindset on policy issues. It's not uncommon for Jessica and I to be outside a hearing and say, hey, it's cool to be working for the co-op movement, because we show up with eyes on the best interest of the member, not eyes on the best interest of our Wall Street or outside owner. And it's meaningful, and I it's really heartening and genuine, and for our our credit union movement members, engage.
So that reminds me, you remind me to put in a plug for our Credit Union Day in the State House on April 8th this year. We already had kind of like the exhibit kind of thing on the first day or second day of the session. But April 8th, starting sometime during the noon hour and running through the afternoon, is a day where we'll bring together, hopefully, a lot of credit union leaders from throughout the state of Vermont, and have them hear from different elected officials, typically party leaders, chamber leaders, so on and so forth, some statewide officials, and get updates about specific legislation in more detail than we did today. And then we always cap things off at the end of the afternoon with a legislator reception that by that time of year, legislators seem pretty keen on enjoying a reception that's provided to them by credit unions. So it's a good way for us to help them start wrapping up their legislative session by remembering, oh yes, credit unions are those guys that gave us a good reception, but in addition to all the hot issues and everything that we've educated them on.
Yeah, you guys always have shrimp. They appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yes, they don't get that every day. So any other parting thoughts? Are we good for this session?
All right. We'll see you again on the other side.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Adam and Jessica. We've reached the end of another Vermont Credit Unions On Air podcast and hope you found it interesting. You can hear all of our previously recorded podcasts by searching for Vermont Credit Unions On Air in the iTunes Store or on SoundCloud.com. If you've got ideas for a podcast and something you'd like to hear about, send it to podcast at Vermont Credit Unions. That's Vermont Credit Unions with an S.coop, C-O-O-P. Until our next podcast, this is Joe Bergeron with
Jessica Oski.
Matthew
Adam Necrason.
at the Association of Vermont Credit Unions, thanking you for listening.